Challenging the System, a look inside a major investigation of harassment in Italy's media industry, by Alessandra Vescio. Three journalists explain their investigation into harassment and sexism in Italian journalism schools. From February to October 2024, freelance journalists Francesca Candioli, Roberta Cavaglia, and Stefania Prandi interviewed more than 200 students and inside sources who, over the last 10 years, had attended one of the 10 journalism schools recognized by Ordine Nazionale dei Giornalisti, the body that regulates the journalism profession and its members in Italy. What has come to light shows how common it is for women journalists to experience abusive behavior and sexual harassment even at the beginning of their careers. The investigation. Quote, "Our investigation started after receiving 3 initial reports of gender discrimination and sexual harassment during informal conversations with journalism students and writers," end quote. Prandi said, and, quote, "It seemed to us all, and still does, that it was particularly serious that these events could occur already in the training stage, when the power imbalance between trainers and trainees is particularly pronounced," end quote. That is why they have decided to delve into it. Candioli, Cavaglia, and Prandi first launched a survey to collect stories and information on cases of harassment and sexism in journalism schools and during affiliated internships, and then turned to student lists posted on school websites. Social media were also useful to, quote, "get in touch with the students and collect the stories of those who had expressed interest in talking to us," end quote, Prandi explained. The results, published on the independent investigative media outlet IRPI Media, are upsetting. As Cavaglia shared, quote, "Half of the respondents stated that they had witnessed or were aware of sexual and verbal harassment, attempted sexual violence, stalking, blackmail, and gender discrimination. 1/3 of the respondents described in detail the abuse they had experienced," end quote, also providing names, screenshots, emails, documents, and videos. According to the students, abusive behavior was carried out by teachers, tutors, and colleagues inside and outside of the classrooms, as well as by journalists during their internships. Quote, "None of the people we heard had reported to the police what they had suffered," end quote. Among the many stories collected, a member of a school of journalism broadcasting in Perugia told of a tutor who always sought physical contact with women students with, quote, "unsolicited hugs," end quote, touching, or, quote, "winking," end quote. Some members of a Walter Tobagi School of Journalism in Milan recounted the episode of a tutor who sat next to a student, started talking to her more closely, and then touched her tie. More than one trainee at the Urbano School reported having experienced or heard of harassment during their internship, with journalists making comments on their appearance and sending texts with sexual content. Quote, "Nearly 250 accounts are not a statistically valid sample," end quote, Cavaglia said. Quote, "But if half of them have witnessed or experienced harassment, we can consider it a wake-up call," end quote. Economic, legal, and emotional issues to consider as freelance journalists. Conducting an investigation, especially on sensitive topics such as harassment and abuse, can be difficult and requires being aware of potential risks and problems. First, the legal aspects. Cavaglia pointed out that they could rely on, quote, "the constant support from IRPI Media and 2 lawyers who work with them," end quote. She also explained that they offered the right of reply to the counterparts interviewed by institutions involved in the investigation and asked them to reply, quote, "by email and or in video calls that lasted up to an hour and a half and or by phone," end quote. The emotional and psychological factor also needs to be taken into account when investigating such a sensitive topic, both for journalists and interviewees. For instance, not every person Candioli, Cavaglia, and Prandi have contacted decided to open to them. In some cases, they knew that some of those they approached were likely aware of cases of abuse, quote, "but we tried not to insist as soon as we realized that the person we were talking to didn't want to get into it. Some students preferred to put the past behind them, others didn't consider appropriate to trust us. This is pretty normal in an investigation like this, especially when dealing with sensitive topics that could re-victimize people if they are not open to talking about it," end quote, Prandi explained. For the journalists themselves, conducting this investigation was also tough. Cavaglia had said discussions with representatives of the institutions were particularly difficult. Quote, "We had to deal with long-serving journalists, almost all of them men, and we had to assert our authority," end quote. Therefore, working on the investigation as a team, quote, "and knowing that we had the support from IRPI Media was very helpful both on practical and psychological level," end quote, she observed. Finally, there is the issue of economic sustainability. Prandi describes this investigation as the kind of projects, quote, that sometimes freelancers choose to do as a bet or investment for the future. Unfortunately, just publishing the investigation in Italy hardly covers months and months of work, and this was the case for us. We knew that to make it economically sustainable, we would have to take the gamble that it would work, that it would become popular, and then seek all the necessary funds. We plan to apply for grants and start crowdfunding in order to make the project sustainable and expand it. I allow myself to do jobs like this once or twice a year or so because I think they are important from a civic perspective. I think they are necessary, end quote. Although, quote, Italian journalism is still characterized by sexism and patriarchy, end quote, as Candioli put it, the impact of the investigation so far has been very good indeed, making it clear, quote, that this is a good time in Italy to seriously address issues like these, end quote. In fact, quote, more than 50 media outlets, including mainstream Italian media, newspapers, websites, and radio stations, independent publications, newsletters, and podcasts have shared our investigation, end quote. Probably, quote, thanks to the many female colleagues who have worked within their editorial team to relaunch it, end quote, Candioli argued. Work in progress. Also members of Espulse, a collective on investigating sexual harassment and abuse of power in Italian journalism, Candioli, Cavaglia, and Prandi clearly stated that the aim of the investigation was not to, quote, point the finger at anyone, end quote, in particular, nor to, quote, re-victimize the students, end quote, who talked to them, but rather to examine the huge problem of harassment in the media industry in Italy. Prandi mentioned that, quote, the only national research study available on harassment in journalism was published in 2019 and found that 85% of women journalists working in newsrooms said they have been sexually harassed at least once during their career. Almost 3% had been raped, while 8% had experienced attempted sexual assault, end quote. Another investigation conducted last year by Italian journalist Elise Facchini revealed how experiencing gender discrimination and harassment is also very common for freelance journalists. Quote, the question we receive most often in interviews is, why has no one reported? End quote, Prandi said, but she believes the issue here is rather the opposite. Quote, instead of giving young women the responsibility to report, why do we not bother to monitor and intercept any abusers in schools and during internships? What are we doing to prevent this from happening? What more can we do? What can a member of a university, a school, an institution do to improve things individually and collectively? How can I support women students or, conversely, report behavior that I feel is inappropriate to a colleague? End quote. That is why Candioli, Cavaglia, and Prandi decided to bring the stories they collected before the school's representatives and the regional and national bodies that regulate the journalism profession in Italy. Cavaglia revealed that, quote, some schools have considered that they have received reports of harassment and sexism over the past 10 years and have taken action, end quote, while those who declared didn't receive any reports, quote, learned with shock of the cases, end quote, and, quote, assured us that they would investigate the matter thoroughly, end quote. In addition, quote, the regional bodies emphasized that they had limited room for action, but nevertheless committed themselves to addressing the issue with the schools, looking for possibilities to intervene. The president of the National Council of the Ordine dei Giornalisti, Carlo Bartoli, said that he had never received any reports on the matter, not even informally, end quote. All the responses were included in the investigation and are available on Irpi Media. However, as Candioli, Cavaglia, and Prandi stated, the investigation is not over. The survey is still available to those who would like to share their stories, and the Italian journalists want to expand and spread the results. Quote, for too long, harassment has been the norm. It is time for it to finally stop, end quote, Cavaglia said.